Thank you for joining us, everyone. We are ready to begin. Today, we are kicking off Hispanic Heritage Month at the University of Notre Dame, spearheaded by the Institute for Latino Studies. As many of you know, ILS advances the understanding of one of the fastest growing and youngest populations in the United States and in the US Catholic Church. ILS also strengthens the university's original mission to prepare transformative leaders in all sectors of society, including all of the professions, the arts, business, politics, faith, and family life among Latinos and all members of society. Today, we have the pleasure of listening to the work of Luis Ricardo Fraga, who is the Reverend Donald P. McNeil, CSC Professor of Transformative Leadership, the Joseph and Elizabeth Robbie Professor of Political Science, a fellow at the Institute for Educational Initiatives, and the director of the Institute for Latino Studies. He has been on the faculty at the University of Washington, at Stanford University, where I met him as a student 20 years ago, and the University of Oklahoma. He is a native of Corpus Christi, Texas. He received his A.B. cum laude from Harvard University and his M.A. and Ph.D. from Rice University. His primary interests are in American politics, where he specializes in the politics of race and ethnicity, Latino politics, immigration policy, education politics, voting rights policy, and urban politics. Second, today we will hear from Associate Professor Ricardo Ramirez. He is an Associate Professor of Political Science here at the University of Notre Dame. He is also the director of the Hesburgh program. His broad research interests include political behavior, state and local politics, and the politics of race and ethnicity. His research is geared to understanding the transformation of civic and political participation in American democracy by focusing on the effects of the political context on participation, the political mobilization and outreach to Latino immigrants and other minority groups, and the causes and consequences of increasing diversity among elected officials. He received his undergraduate degree from UCLA, PhD from Stanford University, and taught at the University of Southern California before coming to Notre Dame. He is the principal investigator of a longitudinal study of gendered career paths among Latina and Latino elected officials. And today he joins us along with ILS Director Luis Fraga upon the recent publishing in May 2020 of their book, Latinos and the 2016 Election, Latino Resistance and the Election of Donald Trump. They did this together, edited by Gabriel R. Sanchez. And today's talk is called Latinx Voters in the 2020 Election. So there's no question that this vote, the Latino vote, will be crucial in this year's presidential election. And we are so fortunate to gather today to understand the impact of Latinos in this 2020 election. And to do that, we need to step back 4 years to the victory of a president who has made anti-Latino and anti-immigrant sentiment a staple of his presidency. So with that, my name is Paloma Garcia Lopez, and I'm the Associate Director of ILS, which I failed to mention at the beginning of this. And we are so proud to have all you here today, a great response, a great group, and a great number of questions. So with that, I will hand it off to Professor Luis Fraga.
Thank you very much, Paloma. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you to everyone out there. We can't see you, but we know you're there. And we greatly appreciate your helping us kick off our events for Hispanic Heritage Month, which the Institute for Latino Studies is very happy to initiate, organize, and continue even in this virtual way. I thought I would use my 15 minutes by focusing on 5 specific facts, 5 specific facts that I think everyone needs to know to understand the Latino vote. I do this because one hears a lot of pundits, one hears a lot of journalistic analysis about what Latinos think, whether there really is a Latino, whether there really is a Latinx community, and so forth. And so I thought I would try to give us 5 facts to always keep in mind, to be analytical and to be insightful in interpreting this sort of information. Number 1, the Latino vote is growing in absolute terms in this election cycle, as it has been since at least the mid-1980s. That is driven largely by population growth. And increasingly, it's driven by population growth among US-born Latinos. Think of it this way. 60 million Latinos, Latinx people, Latinas live in the United States. Approximately 11.7 million are eligible to participate. 11.7 million, excuse me, 32 million are eligible to participate. Approximately 11.7 million have participated in our most recent election. That population growth is due to births in the United States of US citizens since the decade from 1990 to 2000. More Latino population growth has been due to US births on US soil than it has been due to immigration. One figure that may be helpful in thinking about this is that it is estimated nationwide that approximately 800,000 Latinx people, Latinos, Latinas, turn 18 every year. And 94% of those are born in the US, are US citizens. So just from that number, you get a sense that this is a growing population and a population largely of US citizens. Number two, with this growth has also come a growing participation gap. Professor Ramirez will talk specifically about elements of why that's the case and what that means and so forth. What I want to focus on here is that as the Latino population has grown, as Latino US citizens have grown, as the eligible Latino population to vote has grown, the gap between Latino population and Latino voters and eligible Latino voters and African American voters and white voters has grown as well. So there is a dysfunction, if you will, in our political system that seems to not be able to handle. And I know oftentimes, Professor Ramirez will talk about this, oftentimes the blame is put on Latino voters themselves, but it's a little more complicated than that. But that gap has been growing as our population has been growing. Number three, and this is something that Professor Ramirez and I spoke about in an article that we published in 2004. What matters most to understanding the Latino vote is what impact it has for both parties in combination with white voters, African American voters, Asian voters, Native American voters, and others. That is, you can't just see the Latino vote as the most important vote. It depends on how other people vote, and it depends on the coalition that's put together by the candidates. A smaller percentage of Latino voters could be a critical contributor, not determinative, but contributor to a candidate winning, depending on how the other segments of the population vote. Think of it this way. You always have to look at the Latino vote in context of a specific election and in context of the distribution of preferences of other segments of the electorate. That's why competitive states like Arizona in this upcoming election, like Nevada in this upcoming election, like Florida in this upcoming election. That's why these states are important, because Latinos are not going to determine who wins, but Latinos in combination with white voters and African American voters, and it gets more complicated in Florida, of course, but still, Latino voters can be very important either for Democrats or for Republicans. These swing states are swing states because of the potential contribution Latinos can make in combination with the distribution of voters from other ethnic racial groups, and that can apply to both Republicans as well as Democrats. Number four, the average Republican support from Latinos in presidential elections, I calculated this number in the last presidential election, based on exit polls. From the time we've been having exit polls of Latino voters and polls that are done, pre-election exit polls that are done of Latino voters, the average level of support, people are shocked by this when I mention it. Many people say, no, you're wrong. I said, no, that's what the numbers say. The average Republican support among Latinos since the mid-1970s up through Donald Trump's election is about 28.4%. So you have to understand that I say 75-25, that about 25% of Latinos will vote for any Republican candidate who runs for office. Oftentimes we hear, oh, well, man, Trump is doing very well, and Trump did very well, and George Bush did very well. Actually, George W. Bush did, in fact, do particularly well among Latino voters. But you have to understand the normal distribution of partisan votes among Latinos. And we, as Latinos, don't vote 90% Democrat, 10% Republican. We vote 75% Democrat. Different in Florida, 75% Democrat and 25% Republican in presidential elections pretty consistently. The thing to think about is whether that percentage of 25% goes up or down in a particular election, and to see what the polls are saying. The polls are early now, and you probably shouldn't give much credence to the polls and what they're saying right now. But that 25% is a baseline that one uses. One study, excellent data by Latino Decisions, in the 2016 election indicated that Donald Trump only got 18% of the Latino vote. That's nuts, 10% less than the average over those years, and about 7% less than you would expect under a normal partisan distribution. Those margins, those differences become extremely important in understanding how well the two campaigns and the two candidates are doing. There's some speculation that Texas might be in play. The polls indicate that that might be the case. There are reasons why it might be or might not be. Professor Ramirez is going to talk a lot about mobilization. This is the reason that there is what I call a conversion strategy that the Democratic Party is using to try to convince voters who supported Trump, particularly suburban white voters, a conversion strategy to try to get them to support the Biden-Harris ticket is to lower that percentage below that normal 25%. We'll see if that turns out to be the case or not. Then lastly, I'm even gonna finish early. The increased presence of Latinos and the growth in the Latino electorate, which nobody can say is not the case, and the increased presence of Latinx voters in many different parts of the country, especially in certain critical swing states, like we said, Nevada, Arizona, Florida in particular, that critical vote and the growing vote nationwide, like the growing population of Latinos nationwide, has led to what I refer to in the book that Paloma was holding up there, what I refer to as the paradox of inclusion. The paradox of inclusion is the unanticipated negative consequences of greater Latino participation and growth in Latino presence in the electorate. Let me give you some sense as to what some of those negative consequences are. Number one, Latino communities, Latino voters, leaders within Latino communities, if this 75-25 split continues, run the risk with increased growth that both parties will take them for granted. It's called capture. That they will, of course, appeal to them during election periods, but not actually work to try to increase their participation. Not have innovative strategies that Professor Ramirez is going to talk about as to how to mobilize new voters. Now, both parties are in fact trying to reach out. Both parties are in fact pursuing very interesting strategies. An organization called Voto Latino has been doing some very interesting work at the grassroots level. But the risk is that the elected officials, knowing what the growing Latino population and predicting what the growing Latino population, how the growing Latino population will distribute its votes, that they'll take them for granted once they get into office. A paradox of inclusion. A second one is the risk of symbolic mainstreaming. This is where those elected officials go out and say, "We love you," during election time. We love your family values. We love your patriotism. We love your commitment to military service. We love your commitment to family. We love the way in which you exemplify fundamental American values of investment and sacrifice and commitment. And then once they're in office, they do nothing to help our communities in need, or very little. So that symbolically, we are as a community included, but substantively, the contributions that these elected officials work to try to provide us are minimal. So we get the symbolic benefits of feeling like we're part of American politics, but we're still marginalized in the receipt of public policy gain. A third consequence, I have 2 more minutes. A third consequence is something we've all experienced during the 2016 campaign and have experienced since the 2016 campaign and the inauguration of the Trump administration. This growing presence of Latinos nationally, growing presence in population, and growing significance in the electorate can lead to Latinx communities being targeted for vitriolic negative campaigning and negative policy targeting. The policies regarding immigration, the policies questioning the loyalty of Latinos, the policies and the campaigning that have occurred dehumanizing Latino immigrants, and by implication, many Latinos overall, if not all Latinos overall, is a response to the perception of threat, is a response to the concern that the country has changed too much, and Latinos are a fundamental part of those shifts that are occurring. And lastly, an unexpected consequence is that Latino leaders and Latino politicians assume that this growing presence of Latinos means we're always going to grow in our political power. It's the demography is destiny argument. And demography, it doesn't always lead to destiny, although it can be a very important part and is a very important part, as I just said. But participation in politics, the responsiveness of public officials, the way in which Latinx voters respond to those public officials is a far more complex equation than simply that Latinx voters, with their population growth, even their growth in the electorate, which is real, that will lead to some significant shift in the policy gains that Latinx communities receive. To conclude, I think this election is going to be characterized by 3 major challenges. One is that conversion challenge that I talked about, an overemphasis on suburban voters. A second is a mobilization challenge. Professor Ramirez is going to talk about that in very significant detail. He's one of the nation's, if not the nation's, foremost experts on Latino mobilization and how we should understand Latino mobilization and how significant that is to understanding the power of the Latino vote. But there's a third challenge that is new, and that's the truth challenge. That is how we come to understand campaign ads, how we come to understand the truth behind what the candidates are saying, and the willingness of one particular campaign to say anything, regardless of the truth, regardless of the facts, as a way to try to influence voters, which they have the right to do, as a way to try to influence voters, and sorting through that, thinking through that, understanding that becomes a challenge that we don't have a lot of experience doing. And with a significantly new and growing electorate, it becomes even more difficult to sort through those challenges. I'll stop there and pass it on to my colleague from the Department of Political Science, Professor Ricardo Ramirez.
Thank you so much, Professor Fraga. As usual, you more succinctly than most people could gave us big insights into the Latino electorate. I want to thank the Institute for Latino Studies for hosting this, and also the participants. We welcome you. We hope that we can have events like this in the future in person, but we hope that this is a good substitute for it. So I'm going to be sharing my screen. I'm not as adept as Professor Fraga is at explaining things. I need pictures. So I wanted to touch on this notion of Latinos as a mobilized or neglected electorate. So I want to walk you through some things, some of which Professor Fraga already touched on. First is, the way I like to think about Latinos with the reference point of comparing it to other populations is thinking about them not just as people, but perhaps thinking about it as emerging markets. So if you look at this graph, what the figure takes you from 1960 to 2016 and then projections to 2060. If you were going to invest, where would you put your money? Where is the growth market? Where is the emerging market? The numbers tell us that by the year 2060, Latinos are estimated to be nearly a third of the population. And whites will have gone from 85% of the population in 1960 to 43%. So that's a significant transformation of the US population in 100 years, right? But it's not just about the numbers. It's about the narratives that we tell, the stories we tell about Latinos. And I talk about this as the rinse, recycle, and reuse of narratives about Latinos. So in 2016, there was this Time magazine article that said why Latinos will pick the next president. One of our featured guests last year, Lalo Alcaraz, is a cartoonist. You'll notice I like to use his very poignant cartoons. So, there's the Latina with the holding up the very large Latino vote, right? So this is one narrative that pops up. Earlier in March, you had this title, like why the Latino vote is so important, talking about the Democratic primary, but then also down in the future. This is a BBC story. More recently, within the last week, you have this statement about Latino preferences and could Biden's Latino problem lose him the White House? So this goes into that notion that Latinos could be pivotal, right? And now you have this one that talks about with Trump's support lagging among other groups, that Trump is now focusing on Latino voters and maybe setting aside his tough talk on immigration. And you see in the background, Latinos for Trump, right? So that's one narrative. But with that narrative is what one of my other colleagues has called the Christopher Columbus problem with Latinos, where Latinos, and this is the symbolic mainstreaming, right, that Professor Fraga mentioned, where politicians seem to discover, and the media seems to discover Latino voters every election cycle in the last 45 days, 50 days before an election. And they're so surprised, like, oh my gosh, look at Latinos, right? So that's, these are the narratives that pop up. Those tend to be more positive. But there's this one other issue, and Professor Fraga referred to this, right? It's the turnout problem, right? So when statistics are talked about, they look at the voter turnout rates of adult citizen Latinos by election year, or comparing it to other groups. What this doesn't capture is that this is of eligible voters, not actual voters. So when people will home in on this particular statistic and say less than 50% of Latinos vote. Well, it's not less than 50% of registered voters. It's less than 50% of eligible voters, right? So that leads to a negative narrative as well. And I saw one of the questions that was posed. I already had this up there, but I noticed this question that said, why these narratives about the Latinos as a sleeping giant, right? I've hated that narrative myself, but it keeps being used. So this was back in 2013. Lalo Alcaraz also has, playing off of that notion of a sleeping giant, it has Julian Castro and Ted Cruz, as the alarm clocks that will wake the sleeping giant. Again, Lalo Alcaraz, talks to us about the eligible Latino voters but then the sole lonely Latino actual voter, right? And it gets at the disparity between this notion, the eligible Latino voters versus the actual voters. And if you notice in this story back in 2018, it's like, according to the recent polls, the discontent in the Latino community with the Trump administration could radically change the midterm elections. And then this is in parentheses, if Latinos actually go out to vote, right? So there's always that but, you know, so that negative narrative. So these narratives talk about the growing Latino non-voters, the fact that they don't, that they might feel cynical or apathetic towards the political system. And the fact that, you know, we shouldn't expect them to always react to threat or fear. So again, I change it to a positive narrative. Instead, think about Latinos as, Latino voters as market opportunities, not fixed, but dynamic and growing. You see, where's that dynamism coming from? The median age. Professor Fraga made reference to this in terms of the youthful nature of Latinos. In 2013 and 2019, the median age of Latinos was 28 and then 29 years of age. What does this translate to potentially? Well, the Latino vote could double in 20 years. So that's a positive narrative. But with, you know, the thing to focus on is the widening gap of those who are eligible to vote, so citizen voting age population, versus those who are registered. And if you see, I want to focus on that particular gap. And that gap has been getting bigger and bigger. So these are the eligible but not registered voters. But again, we shouldn't think about Latinos just as a national Latino electorate. How are state elections won and lost? Well, they're won at the state level. So what does it look like? We know that there's 13.3 million eligible Latinos to vote who are not registered. How does this play out in states? It's 3.4 million voters, potential Latino voters who are registered, compared to the 4.2 who actually are registered. Now I want you, I'm gonna speed through these a little bit, but I want you to keep in mind the gap, or the fact that in some states you have almost as many eligible but not registered voters as those who are actually registered. So the gap has grown. There has been an upswing in California. We looked at Texas. The gap is much closer, right? You have almost as many eligible non-registered Latinos than those who are registered. We look at Florida, the perennial swing state. The gap is a little bit bigger. New York, it's about, it's closer, right? That gap is smaller. It's almost non-existent in Illinois. In Arizona, the gap is a little bit bigger. New Jersey, it's significantly bigger. Colorado, it's very close, very narrow. So then I want to take you in terms of the kinds of mobilization that we either expect or people talk about. So in 2016, they talked about Latinos as being thankful to Donald Trump for making them angry, right, and getting them to the polls. You know, real close to the election cycle, they were talking about this fear and loathing among Latinos that was going to turn them out to vote. But does that always mobilize? That can mobilize, but we need to think about that. If you get enough fear and threat, it could actually demobilize or make people not go vote. And beyond the whether they're mobilized to vote by fear or threat, we need to understand that it's voting costs time and efforts, right? And there was a ranking of states in terms of how easy it is to vote or how difficult, based on, you know, when you need to register by, you know, if you need forms of ID. So it ranked all the states. And these are the 5 states in 2016 with the greatest cost of voting. How does that translate to the different populations? You have 20% of Latinos living in those states, 20% of Blacks, yet only 14% of whites. So Latinos experience much more cost to voting than whites. And And then in terms of the other kind of mobilization that we could see, we know that states that are battleground states mobilize people because the campaigns spend more money. Well, lo and behold, Latino and Asian voters happen to live in states that are not competitive. So greater cost of voting and lower incentives to participate given the battleground nature of the states where they live, right? So whites and African Americans tend to have higher percents of their population, of their registered voters in these battleground states. And it changes every cycle, right? So I went through and actually calculated that. And then to answer some of the questions that people posed in terms of, I looked at the self-reported rates of mobilization. So what are parties and nonpartisan organizations doing to actually get the vote out, right? So I was focusing on neglect. So the greater number of neglect, the worse the situation is, right? So the Latino population is very heterogeneous. The least neglected among the age groups is the youngest, and then those that are the 50 to 59. Surprisingly, single voters are less neglected than married voters. That's not the case among other populations. And then there was a question about religion. While Catholics are sought after by partisan groups and nonpartisan groups, actually I took this data is drawn from commercial data where they have an algorithm based on a lot of information that they get, whether they can identify what your marital status is, your religious affiliation, your income. When they don't know what you are, you get neglected less. And then again, who else is neglected in terms of partisans? Republicans tend to be a little bit more neglected. And most definitely, those who live in non-battleground states are more neglected than the battleground. The thing to focus on is that it's the nonpartisan groups that sometimes reach the harder to contact folks. I think I'm running out of time. How much time do I have?
3 minutes.
3 minutes, okay. So was there a mobilized electorate in 2018? Leading up to the election, so just a few weeks, 6 in 10 Latinos hadn't been contacted by anybody, right? I made the case in a Guardian article that Democrats continue to neglect Latinos and still expect their votes. But we did see Latino turnout was up 174% after the election, right? So we looked at it, and lo and behold, the Democrats and through Lujan, the first Latino to serve as the DCC chair, he attributed that to the high turnout among the Democratic base based on this unprecedented $30 million investment, right? So they had this 3 or 4 state strategy in the Southwest, media buys, and they're like, look at us, we are spending so much money on Latinos. That's $30 million. That's nothing to scoff at. But what was the, and this is what it looked like. So they launched a multi-state Spanish TV ad to boost Latino turnout. But that's $30 million out of how much that was spent in that whole election. $3 billion between both parties. And even if you just look at Democrats, they spent $1.5 billion overall and only spent $30 million on Latinos. Is that how you should treat an emerging market? So I'll just close with this, and I think the timing ended up working out well. The question to look at is in terms of threat, and again, I close with Lalo Alcaraz's, one of his more recent comics, and he says, believe me, I got the Latino vote locked up. Will this be mobilizing, or will this just exemplify the neglect of Latino voters and the fact that Democrats assume that Donald Trump by himself could mobilize Latinos by getting them to be scared? We noticed this, and Professor Fraga mentioned Voto Latino. Latino groups are actually bypassing the Democratic Party to actually do things that help reduce the cost of participation, right? So they're actually doing get out the vote campaigns, whereas the Democrats and even Republicans, they're focusing on media buys. So, and that's why I purposely made it to where we didn't know what the mobilized or neglected is. Is it because of what Democrats are doing and neglecting Latino spending? Or do we see it based on their expected reaction to Donald Trump? And I'll close there. Let me stop sharing.
Right, thank you. Thank you both. So we will now go to the questions portion of our presentation, and this is from a student. He says, I have noticed that despite his history of anti-Latino and anti-immigrant statements, quite a few Latinx folks still support the current president. This question is for Professor Fraga. What do you think explains this phenomenon? And has the Trump campaign been making strides to garner more support from the Latinx community?
Well, I think you can understand it in a number of different ways. First, immigration is a very important issue to all Latino voters, whether they're immigrants or not. And there's a specific percentage of Latino voters who are very anti-immigrant, and oftentimes those individuals are immigrants themselves. And it's a complex phenomena, depends on country of origin. It intersects with social class in very fascinating ways, where upper class Latin American immigrants will feel more comfortable with Donald Trump's sort of approach to criticizing immigrants, when the vast majority of Latino immigrants and their families, even their citizen family members, have a very different view. So that's one component. Another component of the Republican support is abortion. There is a significant percentage of Latinos, whether Catholic or evangelical or some other religious denomination, who will support someone like Donald Trump, regardless of what he says about immigration, because the key issue to them is the issue of abortion. What's important to understand, though, is that you start from that 25% base, and so far, except in Florida, because Florida is different because of its own unique political history, the role of Cuban American voters there, the attitudes towards the Democratic Party because of the Bay of Pigs and all of the suffering that happened as a result of the Bay of Pigs to Cuban Americans in terms of being imprisoned in Cuba and tortured in Cuba and having their political liberties of family members taken away. There is a way of understanding that what Trump is doing is just identifying those people who are already there. And the baseline for that, again, is complex as to why. And these issues related to social class and abortion and so forth don't cut completely cleanly, but I think you find clusters of Latinos who are Republican, who would fit these particular shoes that I'm describing in terms of what may be driving their votes overall. Remember, 25%, is he above it or below it? 25% above it or below it, that's the key to understanding Republican support in this specific election.
Thank you. This question is for a faculty member, and we'll pose it to Professor Ramirez. Do you have any insights into the why President Trump seems to be doing better with Latino voters right now in polling than 4 years ago? If you were an advisor with the Biden campaign, what advice would you give with regard to Latino voters?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. The first thing I would start as an empirical social scientist is looking at the specific polls, right? So where are they sampling? Are they can we compare apples to apples in terms of the polls that were conducted in 2016 versus 2020? If it is the case that, you know, in similar states and similar sampling strategy, you do see Donald Trump doing better in 2016 or 2020 than 2016, then the question then gets at, what have you done for me lately? As you know, basically, are Democrats in the Biden campaign making an appropriate case in terms of what Democrats will do and have done to this new Latino electorate. We've got to remember that it's also not a static electorate, right? So they sampled the Latino voters that were there in 2016. Well, we've had an influx of a lot more new Latino voters, some of them because they became citizens and registered to vote, and others because they turned 18. So they weren't voters then. So the thing is, compare apples to apples, and also find out if the new segments of the electorate that have come in have been indecisive. So maybe Donald Trump might be doing slightly better once you take out the undecided, but once you put it back in, it might look a little bit different. So again, some of these polls, they might not be sampling enough in Spanish. They might, there's a lot of things where some of the mainstream polls don't sample in language. They don't sample in high density Latino neighborhoods. They don't, so I would want to see some of those things. So I think right now the media is being, sensationalist and, rediscovering Latinos again, like I mentioned with that narrative, and just going with the story that will get them clicks. And, I think as we approach the election, we'll have more information on this to actually tease out these numbers.
Thank you. Our next question is from a staff member at Notre Dame for Professor Fraga. Given that Latinx voters tend to be Catholic Christians, will Trump's faux Christian pandering trump Biden, the latter of whom has repeatedly voted pro-choice? What role will religiosity play in the 2020 election?
Right now, I think if it follows the same pattern as in the past, for a small subset of Latino voters, maybe 10%, maybe 15%, issues associated with reproductive rights and gay marriage is a determinative factor. But for the vast majority of Latinos, even Latinos who indicate that they are against abortion and are not supportive of gay rights, these are not the significant issues that are going to determine their vote. It might be immigration. It might be the response of the White House to COVID-19. It might be the vitriolic anti-immigrant, anti-Latino sentiment that the president consistently pursues. And I noticed in his recent town halls, he went back to Latinos and Latino immigrants to talk about them in a very negative way after focusing almost exclusively on the threat to the suburbs of the protests that are occurring in major urban centers. So we're always right there, just under the surface. So in terms of religiosity, for some small subset of Latinos, that's very important. But for most Latinos, even when they have views that are inconsistent with Biden-Harris regarding reproductive rights and gay marriage, those aren't the issues that drive them. Other issues drive them. Jobs, the economy. I would guess these days it's the pandemic and all of the economic challenges associated with the pandemic, and the way in which there's a beautiful commentary made by a professor of infectious diseases, I believe, from the Baylor College of Medicine, where he says, I get daily reports on who's dying. And he read the names off: Latino, African-American, Latino, because he had the demographic data there. There has been a devastation to the Latino community and the African-American community of this pandemic that should make every Latino pause and think about the extent to which this will continue if we continue with the same administration in office, and whether Biden might be in a better position to try to deal with this. So religiosity, attitudes towards abortion, reproductive rights, and same-sex marriage are important, but only to a relatively small segment of the Latino electorate.
Thank you. Our next question is from a community member. It is for Professor Ramirez. Mainstream coverage has not covered Latinx voters. Please give us a sense of the predictions and differences among states. How come the Latinx impact is not yet there in obvious ways? The talk of the sleeping giant has been a trope of the last 3 or 4 elections. When will the giant be walking and waking and talking?
That's an excellent question. And that I was glad to see that question, given that I was preparing over the weekend for this talk. And you know, again, that sleeping giant metaphor is a favorite of the media because it's easy, and you know they don't. It's a lazy way of talking about Latinos, right? It neglects to talk about the fact that Latinos are a younger population, right? Younger voters of all races vote in lower numbers. So it shouldn't surprise us that they vote at lower numbers. Less Latinos with lower levels of education, or there's a higher percent of Latinos with lower rates of education and lower income. Well, those are the same characteristics that make other people of all races less likely to vote. So once you account for those characteristics, it's not that Latinos don't want to, it's that it's costly to participate. They also tend to be more urban. We know that the costs of voting are significantly higher for Latinos and other minority communities when they are urban. We look at the long lines at the polls, and you know, we're asking people who tend to who have a higher share of their working adults working service sector jobs who may not get the time off. Because they're younger, they also tend to have kids, so they have childcare responsibilities. They have a lot of additional costs that other populations don't. So again, not to just knock the media, but it tends to be that they look for sensationalist headlines, or they're lazy or uninformed, you know. So they seem to only want to, you know, it's not just politicians that have the Christopher Columbus syndrome. It's also among the media. They always discover Latinos right before the election cycle. If you look at all you'd have to do is look at the range of newspapers and television ads and stories and see when Latinos are talked about, and you would see it, Latino voters, it would all be within, you know, a significant portion would be the last 30 days before an election cycle. So, you know, in order for the media to change the way they talk about Latinos, it will require sustained, I guess, difference making in elections. So helping either party win a particular state or election. But it would also be incumbent upon the political parties. Again, not only are Latinos the largest ethnic or racial group now, but they're estimated to be a third by 2060. So, you know, I think that will, once you see a transformation in terms of the way the parties deal with Latinos, not as scapegoats or not as accusing that they're the ones that didn't turn out enough and let Republicans win, you know, then I think you'll also see a transformation in the way media also talks about it.
Thank you. Thank you. This is for Professor Ramirez. If you could take a moment to go back to the slide by slide, your slide that was state by state registered and versus eligible and not registered, and prepare that for a moment to comment on it. Oh, you got it right away. There was a couple of our viewers that wanted you to just mention that. Well, we are seeing your slides now.
Okay. So a lot of it, what I mentioned before, is to focus on that potential area of growth. These are not foreign born or young people that aren't eligible to vote. These are all eligible to vote. So if either political party wanted to grow their base, this is fertile ground to do so. 3.4 million people Latinos in California, 2.7 in Texas. So just between those two states, it's over 6 million new voters that they could go after. That would require getting them registered to vote and following up and making sure that they vote. The gap between Latinos and non-Latinos in voting, once they're registered, almost disappears, right? So the biggest gap happens to be getting them registered. Given the higher share of young people and immigrants among Latinos, if they haven't been socialized, by their parents or great-grandparents to vote and explain the system as African Americans and white Americans have had, then you need a political party and organizations to help them overcome those barriers. So those are the two largest states. Look at Florida; it's still almost 1.5 million people. If Florida is decided by less than 10,000 voters consistently, 10 or 20,000 voters, you have 1.4 million unregistered Latino voters. And given the heterogeneity of Latinos in Florida, that could help either party. But then again, it requires going after them early, going after them, when it's not an election cycle. Once voting is habitual. Once you vote once, then you will vote again. So, it baffles me why neither party invests in voter registration the way that political parties used to. I'll just go through a few other states real quick. New York, and I went by size. So this is the fourth largest concentration of Latinos, over 800,000 eligible Latinos. Illinois, over 500,000. Again, those two states tend to go blue, but it wouldn't take much to, help one party or another either lock in their rates of voting for their candidates or help balance it out if they reached out. Arizona, this state is going to be very much in contention, both in the U.S. Senate race, but also down the line. I have been talking about Arizona for about 7-10 years about that being the next state to potentially change their partisan loyalties precisely because of Latinos. And that's what we're seeing. You have seen an upsurge of Latino registered voters, but you still have a lot more that you could register. New Jersey, Colorado is could be in play as well in the U.S. Senate race. Again, but this would have required Democrats to go after those voters early and get them registered to vote. Obviously, the COVID situation makes things harder, but so I hope that those graphics helped you out a little bit more. And I went from largest concentration of Latinos to smallest among the top Latino states.
Thank you. We have about 2 minutes left. This question is from an alumnus. Professor Fraga, my impression is that Latinos vote in lower percentages than our population generally. Why is this? Is it because they come from national backgrounds where one's vote might not carry the same weight as it does in the United States?
That's probably the reason for a small portion of Latino naturalized citizens. I think it has much more to do with, as Professor Ramirez was saying, much more to do with the history of family tradition, lack of outreach by campaigns and elections. Don't misunderstand me. I don't mean just putting a video out there that talks about it, that has a brown face or brown faces of various shades, shall we say, since Latinos are a complex community in terms of national origin and skin tone and so forth, right? But rather that invests on building infrastructure, that invests on building neighborhood-based groups where neighbors are mobilizing neighbors, or where parties are helping neighbors mobilize neighbors. As some of Professor Ramirez's research has shown, if you'll permit me, Ricardo, contacting by a co-ethnic, someone who is like you and from your neighborhood, is among the most effective way to mobilize Latino voters. For all the Notre Dame students and other university students in the audience, it's not the university student who comes from somewhere else, knocks on the door and says, hey, I want you to register to vote, or I want to mobilize you and so forth. That, of course, is very helpful. Not as helpful as having your neighbor next door come to you and say, let me tell you why it's important that we all register to vote and try to mobilize ourselves to vote. And the challenge this year, we haven't talked about this, but one of the challenges this year is that personal contact is very difficult with regards to COVID-19. And if that personal contact is what is key, it's not going to happen, because it shouldn't happen for public health reasons. So there's a need not just to spend money on television ads and radio ads and ads on Spanish language TV and English language TV and everything of that sort. You've got to find a way of mobilizing neighbors, maybe going back to the old days of the telephone, where you have your neighbor call 10 neighbors on the same street and say, are you registered? Do you know when the deadline is? I don't care whether you vote Republican or Democrat. I just want you to have a voice. And you should have a voice for yourself and for your children. You throw in the kids, and you're much more likely to get Latinos doing almost anything that you want them to do, because we're so future oriented regarding the next generation. So I think there are ways in which there's going to be a need for extraordinary creativity. I haven't seen that so far. And I worry that because it's not occurring, we're going to see only marginal increases in the presence of the Latino vote, other than what you might expect just because of the growing population. And so what Professor Ramirez was referring to close that gap, we have to increase that participation even further. And that's not easy to do.
Well, thank you both. That brings our webinar to a close. Thank you, Professor Fraga. Thank you, Professor Ramirez, for speaking with us today. Thank you for our friends at the Department of Political Science at NDI Mexico, all the students and alumni and colleagues and community members who joined us today. We hope to see you on Monday, September 21st at our U.S. Census talk, Overcoming the Politics of Erasure. And happy Hispanic Heritage Month, everyone. Visit us at latinostudies.nd.edu for more information. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Paloma. Thank you, Ricardo.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, everybody. Thank you.